Chapter 2. Mr. Wolfwood, florist for you, it's urgent. Jessica never yelled down the hall for him to pick up the phone. She took messages and made call lists, because that's how old Mr. Chapel had liked it done, and it suited Nick fine. So he almost fumbled the receiver in his speed to pick up the line in his office, and it took him a minute to remember how to answer a transferred call. Wolfwood speaking. Yes, hello, how are you? Fine, said Nick. What's the issue, ma'am? The crisply enunciated, vaguely European, French, maybe? Accented voice on the other end of the line said, I'm so sorry, but our delivery driver is in the hospital with an emergency, and we are simply slammed. You're due a delivery of arrangements this afternoon, so I was hoping we could work out some kind of pickup. Nick shifted the phone to his shoulder and held it with his head so he could let his fingers fly on his keyboard. Today. Yes, tonight's viewing is for a Mr. Jones, who hadn't had an in lieu of flowers on his obit, so it would probably be a lot of arrangements. He'd need the van, except Livio had 2 pickups to make. Yeah, okay, Nick said, doing quick mental math. Yeah, I can work it out on our end to send someone down there with the van before noon, or by noon at the latest. Thank you for letting us know this early. It was barely past 10 a.m. Absolutely, darling, said the crisp voice. Nick wished he'd remembered to ask her name. She probably assumed he knew it. This florist was their go-to supplier, but she always talked to Jessica, not Nick. I'm an old hand at this. I know the priorities. I'm sorry about your driver, Nick said. Oh, thank you, she said. They'll be all right, I think. Nothing too serious. Good to hear. I'll see someone before noon, then? Yes, thank you again. Nick hung up, jotted a couple things on a sticky note, and jogged up the hall to the front room. Jess, he said, sticking his head around the corner. Where's Brad? Dentist, Jessica said, looking up at him with wide eyes. He'll be back by 1, he said. Nick cursed under his breath. Yeah, I remember now. Okay, can you call Livio and ask him to come in early? If he can get viewing room 2 set up, I can run out for the flowers and he can take the hearse for pickups later. Sound good? Jessica nodded and scribbled some hurried notes. Okay, you've got a meeting at 1:30? Nick nodded. Yep, I need to make about 5 phone calls right now, so just don't pass anyone on for now, okay? Okay, we've got this. Plenty of time. Nick gave her a thumbs up and got to it. By the time he passed Livio in the carport, he was already exhausted and ready for the day to be over. Still, he waved at Livio, got behind the wheel of the van, and carefully backed out of the spot, still not used to the amount of clearance this behemoth needed. The florist, as Jessica had reminded him, was called Red's Roses, and their contact was the owner, Elandira Rousseau. It wasn't too far away, only about a 5-minute drive with all green lights. Nick wove carefully through the flower shop's parking lot to the back entrance, where there was a loading door. Not exactly truck-sized, but a double door with a ramp at least. He parked the van at the edge of the lot and hopped out, not sure if he should barge in through the back or not. Figuring he might as well try to make a civilized entrance, he made his way around to the front door of the shop. The air inside was humid, but not overly warm, unlike a greenhouse, and the smell of green overpowered any individual flower scent. It was a nice little setup, crowded with tall pails of cuttings in every color, a wall of upright coolers, misters sticking down from the ceiling above every flower-loaded table. A couple of employees bustled around helping customers arrange bouquets, and one stood to the side with a man in a suit, obviously consulting about something bigger. Birthday party, wedding, who knew? Nick made his way toward the front and was brought to a sudden halt at the sight of Blondie? At first glance, from the back, he could have sworn. But no, as soon as he got a second look, he changed his mind. It wasn't Blondie, but the man at the counter was of an eerily similar build, with paler blonde hair, almost platinum. He was talking to a glamorously made-up woman at the counter, whose fashion style all but shouted, "Ready for my close-up, Mr. DeMille." The woman was just in the middle of saying, "Not a colony collapse, it's just a swarm. They happen." "I don't trust Arcadia," said Not Blondie. "I don't know what pesticide they use. They probably caused it." The woman, Rousseau, Nick presumed, sighed and rolled her eyes. "Badwick's inexperienced, but he isn't a fool. He's treating the place well. Colonies get too big, they split. That's their nature. He's just concerned about the swarm setting up in the wrong spot, you know? Makes everyone's life difficult. If you don't take care of it now, in the end the only solution is calling an exterminator." Not Blondie made a frustrated noise. "Well, I can't go there this afternoon. We're too busy." "You always are," said Rousseau, and Nick wasn't sure what that was in her voice. Wistfulness? Accusation? "But there's someone I can call," Not Blondie muttered, almost too quiet for Nick to catch. Rousseau smiled a little. Thank you. Now, you know I'd love to keep you around to chat longer, but... She looked pointedly over Not Blondie's shoulder, right at Nick, and gave him a smile and a small wave. Not Blondie turned around, saw Nick, and immediately ducked his head so as not to make eye contact. Nick hadn't seen Blondie up close, of course, but this guy was even more eerily similar in the face, at least from what Nick had seen. Right, said Not Blondie, and turned quickly to Rousseau to nod his goodbye. Talk to you, another time, he said, and then brushed past Nick on his way to the door. Take care, darling, Rousseau called after him. She sighed and rubbed her hands together, leaning over the counter toward Nick. Can I help you, sir? Nick walked up. Yeah, Nicholas Wolfwood from Conrad? She perked up immediately. Right, yes. Come on around, come to the back. You didn't have to come in this way, all the way around. You can always come in the employee way if you're just picking up. She led him into a much less aesthetically laid out room, where the tables were covered with plant and ribbon scrap, piles of wire and clippers, and glue guns and florist foam in every possible shape. One person was back here arranging. Zane, is everything together for Conrad Chapel? Yep, the little man called. Rousseau showed Nick her organization system, the order tags he should look for on the arrangements to make sure they belonged to his delivery. It didn't take too long to get all the arrangements. 36 of them, good lord. For Mr. Jones' funeral loaded into the back of the van, carefully laid down or propped so they wouldn't fall over. When it was done with, Nick reached out to shake Rousseau's hand. Sorry I haven't been by in person before, Miss Rousseau, he said. Ellen dear, she said, waving the surname away. Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Wolfwood. Nick, he said, smiling his most roguish and winning smile. She smiled back, all old movie glam and softly French accent, and Nick just wished he was half as cool as her. Well then, she said, I look forward to seeing you again, monsieur. As she was turning to leave, he cleared his throat and asked, Hey, not to pry, but who was it you were talking to when I came in? She turned back. Oh, Knives Sovereign. Do you know him? She wrinkled her nose for a moment, looking into the middle distance as though at a mental map. He should work right across the street from you, if I'm remembering the streets right. Oh, huh. Nick shook his head. Don't think I'd seen him before, but it was weird. Like, I don't know, never mind. But Elandira was grinning at him. What? He asked. Weird, like you'd seen a ghost? She asked slyly. Or a doppelganger, perhaps? Nick blinked. Huh? Or an evil twin? She laughed, obviously having way too much fun. Nick opened and closed his mouth. Wait, are there... Elandira waved her hand at him, brushing away the joke at his expense, and said, The Sovereign twins, yes. Not identical, but close enough for a momentary Shakespearean comedy of errors. It makes sense that you've only seen his brother. Knives doesn't like to get out in the sun. Or talk to people. Much more at home with the insects, on the whole. Oh. Nick took this information in. Huh. I really need to get around the neighborhood, get to know some folks. Elandira turned back to her shop, waving over her shoulder at Nick. Don't let Knives put you off, she called. He's a real asshole, but he has a heart of slightly less of an asshole once you get to know him. Thanks for the flowers, Nick called, and Elandira blew him a kiss over her shoulder. Once Nick had gotten into the van's driver's seat, he added to himself, and the warning. A week passed. 2. Before Nick knew it, he'd been working at the funeral home for 6 weeks and had settled into something close to comfort. Not every single day felt like a scramble, because not every single task was a new challenge to master. He yawned through routine paperwork. Calls with doctors got shorter as he began to learn the codes and jargon that made the paperwork faster. He felt like he had more leeway to take plenty of time talking to families. And after 6 weeks, he'd had plenty of time to encounter the less easy versions of those conversations. Kids were the hardest. By far, the hardest. The better he got at the routine, the more he was able to let himself relax. Not every second was spent on the runaround. Some days there would be whole afternoons with no new calls, no vendors to deal with, no viewings in the evening, no burials coming up. There was always a body or two in storage, awaiting their day, but not everybody could be dealt with immediately. Sometimes they laid in the prep room for up to 2 weeks, embalmed and beautiful, waiting. On a slow afternoon, when all Brad could find to do was dust the urns on display and Jessica was spinning gently in her chair, playing Candy Crush on her phone, Nick wandered into the foyer and said, I'm going to go for a walk, unless anyone needs me for the next 20 minutes. Don't think so, boss, Jessica chirped, smiling up at him. Brad just grunted a negative. Nick didn't take it personally. Brad had brought enough of his homemade smoked turkey and wild rice soup yesterday to feed an army, and had glared at Nick standing there with his packet of ramen until he put it in a drawer and sheepishly gotten a bowl of soup instead. According to Jessica, once Brad started feeding you, you were in his good books. Also, the soup had been fantastic. Shout if anything comes up, Nick said, slipping his phone in his pocket and turning back down the hallway. He left out the carport door. Pavlovian response made his mouth water a little bit, anticipating a cigarette, but he shook his head to clear it. The stressful elements of the job were certainly pushing his restraint. He craved more frequently, had a harder time telling himself no. But at least so far he'd been able to keep up his promise to himself that he'd do better. He didn't pretend he was going to wander and take in the sights. He checked the street and then jaywalked his way over to the parking lot he'd been watching for almost 2 months now. He slowed when he neared the chain fence, finally able to look at everything clearly that he'd just been guessing at before. Inside the gate and the fencing, he immediately realized that the place was more welcoming and organized from the inside than it had looked from across the street. The bright bags piled on pallets weren't just the usual topsoil and potting mix, but also a wide variety of specialty mixes for succulents, roses, rhododendrons, fruit trees. As the summer had pressed on, some things had changed. The saplings had changed out for hardy shrubs in pots, and the big flats of all sorts of seedling flowers had reduced to just pansies. The awnings by the red brick building were heavy with hanging ferns now, the bulk bins full of stacks of basket liners made out of dry moss. It smelled of hot pavement and wet greenery, with a faint hint of manure. Nick took a deep breath, unsure if it was a good smell or not. It definitely reminded him of the country. He'd never been a country boy. He nodded at a few friendly shoppers and headed to the door into the building. "Kite! Help! I can't get at the inventory. What did I do?" Nick stopped just inside the door. At the small checkout counter, against a background of shelves full of jelly jars that looked like they'd been labeled by hand, stood Blondie. He was leaning over a shiny, new-looking point-of-sale computer, his expression pinched and pitiful, while he poked helplessly at the keyboard with one bare hand. The other hand was covered with a heavy work glove, holding the second glove which he had clearly just taken off. Up close, Nick realized that his burnished gold blonde hair was gelled up into a ridiculous straight-up spike style, which was already half wilted in the heat of the day. For some reason it worked, suited his face, and brought attention to his pierced ear. He looked both younger and older than Nick had expected, an inherent youthfulness to his almost button nose and the sleepy tilt of his eyes, combined with lines Nick couldn't have seen from across the street. Mostly crow's feet. The man obviously smiled a lot. Right now he wasn't smiling, but looking near tears as he poked at the computer. Someone came in the door behind Nick, said, "Excuse me," and he jumped and got out of the way of traffic with an apology. From a door on the other side of the building, a short, stocky black boy came into the room and beelined for the counter. "What's it this time?" the boy demanded, stepping into Blondie's space. Blondie backed up, looking grateful. "I don't know. I just wanted to add a note. To the fall bulbs. I was trying to see what varieties of daffodil we have on there because Mrs. Graham was telling me about this kind her grandson has in his side yard with a double salmon cup." "Oh my God, I don't care," said the boy, fingers flying over keys. "Just let me untie some knots here, Grandpa. What did you do?" Blondie made a helpless noise. He glanced up around the shop and spotted Nick. His expression cleared at once into friendly openness. He gave Nick a small wave and said, "Oh, hi! Welcome! I know you!" He came out from behind the counter, heading in Nick's direction. Nick's brain stuttered and died for a second. Blondie was getting altogether too close. Oh Lord, Blondie had the greenest eyes, and a small mole under one of them, and lips that looked like maybe he chewed them when he worried. And oh no, Blondie was way hotter than he had looked from across the street, smiling with everything he had, eyes crinkled, teeth white. Nick said dumbly, before his brain rebooted, and he remembered how to act like a human. He blinked hard and held his hand out automatically, so used to shaking everyone's at the funeral home. "Yeah, hi. Hi. I just thought I should come say hello one of these days and not just keep staring at you. People watching from a distance." "Oh, yeah, you're a fixture now. I have customers ask me about you and I have to tell them I don't know any more than you." He laughed and took Nick's hand to shake. Nick flushed hot. He hadn't really thought about everyone else watching him back. Also, Blondie's hand was warm and rough with calluses, and Nick felt he might swoon like a damn Austen character or something. "I'm Vash, by the way," said Blondie. Vash. Odd name. Nick liked it. "Nick," he said. "Nicholas Wolfwood, sorry. I'm the new director at the—" He nodded his head back, over his shoulder, indicating the funeral home. "Oh, okay. I knew Mr. Chappell retired, but I didn't know who—" Blondie, Vash, let go of Nick's hand and tripped over his words for a moment. "I mean, I saw you, but I thought he's too young to, not that it's only old folks who run places like, I mean, you're so, He coughed and laughed loudly, clearly trying to recover. Never mind. I'm just dumb like that. Vash Savram. Nice to meet you, Mr. Wolfwood. Nick, said Nick. Okay, said Vash. There was an awkward pause. At the same moment, Nick started, Sorry, I should let you get back to... And Vash tried, Is there anything you need? The black boy at the register blessedly interrupted with a loud call of, Fixed it, Gramps. Vash turned with relief. Kite, you're a genius, he said, striding back to the counter. Danke, danke. I'm not a genius, Kite grouched. You're just an idiot. And who's a spook? Kite, Vash chided. Kite looked at Nick and shrugged. Call him like I see him, said his expression. Hey, sorry, said Nick, sliding his hands into his pockets and relaxing into his most winning grin. I was just saying hi. I've been in the area too long without making introductions. You do dead people stuff, right? Asked Kite. Nick choked on nothing and turned it into a laugh. I direct the funeral home, yeah. Kite shrugged. 6 of one, half dozen of the other. Vash looked up from the computer again and said, This is Kite, Nick. He waved between them. Hi, Kite conceded to politeness. Nick extracted a hand from a pocket and gave Kite a sloppy salute. Kite snorted and gave a slight eye roll. A young woman approached the counter with a cardboard flat loaded with small seedling trays of pansies. Excuse me, is this where I pay? Kite leapt back around the counter and shouldered Vash out of the way. I got it, he said, and grinned brightly at the customer. To the side, he muttered at Vash. Just let me keep it unbroken for 5 minutes. Vash raised his hands in surrender and backed off. He stepped in Nick's direction and pulled his second work glove back onto his bare hand. I guess I need to get back to it, he said apologetically. Unless I can show you around a little? Yeah, sure, said Nick, heart thumping like an idiot. You can let the heart gardener show you his plants without losing your damn mind, he told himself irritably. Vash perked up immediately when Nick agreed. He headed for the door opposite the one Nick had entered through. Awesome! This way's the greenhouse. The moment he stepped through into the diffuse white light of the plant-filled void, Nick felt the sweat start to form on his forehead and the back of his neck. The greenhouse was not glass, but a huge tarp-sheeted enclosure with a ceiling lower than the building, explaining why he couldn't see it from the other side of the street. It looked to take up a good half of this side of the block. Nick definitely needed to walk around the neighborhood more, or even just drive a different route to work. Low tables absolutely filled the space, with narrow walking paths between. The ground was covered in a layer of smooth pebble gravel, which slid and crunched under Nick's dress shoes. Vash's boots made more sense here, although once again Nick was struck by the incongruity of Vash's long-sleeve shirts, because it was sweltering inside this place. Big fans at the end of every other aisle kept the air moving, added a cool breeze every now and then, but for the most part they were just standing inside a giant plastic bag, and it felt like it. But the contents of said bag, well, Nick didn't have much to compare it to, never having paid much attention to garden centers or greenhouses before, but he was impressed regardless. He didn't spot a single plant that looked less than flourishing. Picky shoppers looking for the best specimens would have a hard time here, because there were no runts. Nick didn't know shit about gardening, really, but it seemed like the space was loaded with things he wouldn't have expected. Isn't it too late to plant this stuff? He hazarded, thinking back to Miss Melanie talking about how she'd grown up in the countryside. She'd always talked about planting as purely a springtime thing. They walked past a table full of young-looking pepper plants and pots of basil. Depends, Vash said cheerfully, brushing some leaves with his gloved hands. Where you're planting, moisture retention, amount of sun, stuff like that. You can still get a solid crop of peppers if you start them now. He paused by one tray of plants and started pointing. Green, no problem. Sweet red might be harder to do right now because they have to stay on the stem longer and they can get sunburn. The angle of the sun gets more direct later in summer. Hot peppers are easy beginner crop plants. They're usually less fleshy than bells, so their grow time is shorter, and they're really forgiving of water lack. These are my favorites. He poked a tray of plants that, to Nick, looked exactly the same as every other plant on the table. Shishito, one plant puts out dozens if you treat it right. Quick toss in a pan until they char a little. I can eat these things like popcorn. Nick listened as Vash moved on to rambling about herbs and bolting and staggering harvests and double producers and why it's good to keep adding plants to a garden all summer. When he started on fall-blooming annuals, Nick finally interrupted him, realizing that if he didn't, this would go on all day. Not that that was sounding like a bad thing. Vash's voice was both upbeat and soothing, not too deep, easy on the ears. Hey, I should probably get back to CC, Nick said. He glanced at his phone. He'd been gone closer to 40 minutes than 20. Shit. Oh, God, yeah, I'm so sorry, Vash said, immediately rounding on Nick and giving him a wide-eyed look of remorse. I get carried away. Just tell me to shut up. No, I really, Nick glanced around at the greenhouse and realized, damn, it's so peaceful in here. Just plants, the light rustle of leaves, and quiet shoppers musing along rows of flowers, thinking about how to make their own worlds more beautiful. Also muggy and sweaty, sure, but nowhere could be perfect. I really enjoyed it. This place it's really nice. Vash broke into a grin again. Thanks, he said. He gestured vaguely. All me and my brother. Kind of a passion project after a weird time in our lives. We both needed something to do, something stable. I think it's going pretty great. I'll say, Nick agreed. For an awkwardly long moment, Nick and Vash just smiled at each other. Okay, I need to get back to, said Nick, while Vash started, I should finish repotting those boxwoods anyway. Nick paused, and when Vash also paused, Nick said, yeah, I'm going. It was really nice meeting you, Vash. You too, said Vash, and held out his hand again. Nick was already shaking it before both of them remembered that Vash was wearing gloves covered in a fine film of dirt. Shit, sorry, Vash said, jerking his hand back. Nick just laughed. It's fine. I'll see you around, I guess? Yeah. Vash immediately ran his hand through his hair, trying to look cool, forgetting about the glove once again. He left a streak of dirt in his hair. What an absolute dork. He was going to ruin Nick if he kept on like this. You need to see more of the neighbors, right? I kind of know everybody. I could walk you around sometime and make introductions if you wanted. Sounds great, said Nick. I might come over on a lunch break again, or something. Sure. Vash realized what he'd done to his hair and flushed a faint pink. He yanked his right glove back on and scrubbed at his head with his bare hand. Oh my God, okay, I've got to go. He turned and hurried away down the aisle. Bye, Nick called dumbly. He walked back to the funeral home on stiff legs, trembling internally with the force of what a fucking idiot he was, and tried to figure out how to explain to Brad and Jessica what the hell had kept him on his walk for so long.